Is Macron to blame for this flare-up, do you think?
I think he largely is, yes. I think he, in many ways, seems to have lost the plot a little bit over the last few weeks. This is somebody, of course, who was elected with a very clear mandate for making changes to the French economy. He has introduced or tried to introduce some initial reforms. But of course, this latest reform, most high-profile reform around fuel tax, as we've been hearing, has been significantly unpopular. He's, of course, now scrapped that proposal for the next year or so at least. But the major issue here, I think, is one of communication. Macron appears to be a very aloof president. He's not very connected to ordinary people. And as we've been hearing, he's failed to make any meaningful announcements of late. And instead, it's very much his Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, who is the person who is up on the podium making these announcements. So Macron has this real disconnect with ordinary people, and that's a major issue. He needs to rectify that and rectify it quite soon in order to avoid any significant protests in the next few weeks. And of course, next week is perceived to be this Act 5. There's going to be an Act 5 of these 5 different acts of protest. So to avoid that, he really does need to change his communication strategy and change it quite quickly.
He is due to speak on Monday. What could he say or do to actually diffuse this tension?
Well, I think acknowledging that there is a problem is always the best way of dealing with this kind of situation. We've tried to draw, people have drawn previously some very vague similarities with the events of May 1968. I don't really think those are particularly valid in most cases here. But in 68, Charles de Gaulle, at that time the president of France, went away for a little bit, came back, and then sort of reasserted his authority. I think Macron could probably do the same here. He could sort of say, look, I'm in control, I'm in charge here. I have listened to you, I've listened to your real concerns, and where appropriate, I've acted. But in some cases, some of this violence seems to be largely kind of aimed at anything, really, rather than any particular clear target. In some cases, particularly on the Champs-Élysées, it seems to be really aimless to some extent, and certainly was last week. But as we've been hearing, the police strategy has changed. I think that's a sense of trying to be a little bit softer and trying to appear a bit more connected towards ordinary people. So I suspect Macron will try and emphasise that a little bit on Monday.
And that's the violence, but what about the Yellow Vest movement? France is infamous for its demonstrations. What's your analysis of this particular movement?
Well, in some ways, it's like nothing we've seen before in France. It's a kind of grassroots movement with no major leader or no kind of clear spokespeople. And it was, of course, at least a few weeks ago, it was very meaningful in terms of clear protests at the standard of living, the cost of living in France. And indeed, as we've been hearing, the very clear disconnect with the price of diesel and the sort of sense that this shouldn't go up any further. Here it's an issue because Macron can't sit down and negotiate with any particular political figure or any trade unionist, because ultimately these people seem to be disconnected from much of mainstream politics. And indeed, some of the more recent violence and agitators seem to be from either the extreme left or more appropriately from the extreme right. So it's not like you can just sit down and negotiate. And I think that's the real issue here. This is a kind of grassroots, widespread movement, and it seems to be based around different parts of France. In some parts of France, there are different concerns to the concerns in Paris. Elsewhere in France, in kind of rural France, there's a real issue around transport and the cost of living. In Paris, it's more about a sense of kind of the elitism of Macron and his government. So it's very hard to pin down exactly who's involved here. And I think so because it's a social media movement, it's not connected to any kind of clear sense of political strategy. That's what makes it very hard to actually investigate and to analyse in more detail. But I think there's a real sense of anger, a real sense of discontent. And I think, as we've been saying, I think Macron and indeed his government could actually address that relatively easily by dropping some of the more kind of controversial reforms that he proposes to the French economy.
But the whole point of Macron was that he was going to succeed where his predecessors failed because of protest in the street and people voting with their feet.
One of the great difficulties of being a French politician, a French president, is, of course, this sense of the French tradition of protest, peaceful protest, to some extent, sometimes violent protest. I think really that the issue with Macron is, yes, he's come to power with these proposals for reforms and clear economic reforms. The issue, I think, here is that he doesn't seem to know about how to deal with them, how to actually face them down. And the fact that we haven't heard very much from him, the fact that he's not front and centre of this, can to some extent be an issue. I mean, personally, I feel that the pressure will really fall on Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, and the government. And I would suspect that Macron, if he's looking around and seeing what previous presidents have done in the past, prime ministers or members of his government have been targets, for potential sackings or at least, reshuffles to try and sort of push the pressure away from Macron. But ultimately, Jacques Chirac in the 1990s, to some extent Nicolas Sarkozy from 2007 to 2012, François Hollande thereafter, the presidents have all seen protest. But this is a very different kind of protest because it's not connected in the same way to union movements or to kind of major political parties. And the reality is that Macron and his party have a massive majority in the National Assembly. They can push through virtually any reform they would like to. And yet here we have a kind of grassroots movement which is threatening some of the stability of the Macron government.
David Lees, thank you very much for having spoken to us on France 24.